Dr. Malachi Rhodes, a black surgeon and CEO, arrives in Elmwood to revive its struggling hospital, only to face relentless racism and corruption. Despite his expertise and humility, he becomes a target of Richard Hayes, a corrupt official who exploits his position to undermine Malachi through public humiliation, sabotage, and systemic prejudice. The story captures the infuriating realities of racism in America, exposing how deeply entrenched biases and abuse of power threaten those striving to make a difference. As Malachi fights back, the stakes escalate, forcing him to confront a system designed to suppress justice and equality. The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden light over the town of Elmwood, a picturesque community nestled between rolling hills. The town square bustled with activity. Children played tag near the fountain, shoppers browsed the quaint boutiques, and an older man strummed a guitar on the corner, filling the air with soft melodies. It was the kind of town that seemed to have escaped time, where neighbors greeted one another by name and local businesses thrived. But beneath its idyllic charm lay a tension that rarely showed itself outright, simmering just below the surface. Dr. Malachi Rhodes parked his modest sedan at the curb outside Maplewood Diner, one of the town's oldest establishments. The car was unassuming, a stark contrast to the sleek, high-end vehicles often associated with someone of his stature. Malachi was a celebrated heart surgeon, the founder of a charitable foundation providing medical care to underserved communities, and a prominent figure in the national conversation about healthcare reform. Yet, here in Elmwood, he was just another visitor, a face unfamiliar to most of its residents. Malachi adjusted his tailored blazer as he stepped out of the car. Though his wardrobe hinted at his success, his demeanor exuded humility. He had learned long ago that credentials and accolades didn't shield him from the prejudices of the world. Elmwood was a town where old traditions lingered, and those traditions weren't always welcoming to outsiders, especially ones like him. Setting the stage. The diner was a small, unassuming building with a bright red awning and windows lined with faded gingham curtains. Inside, the smell of coffee and freshly baked pies mingled with the faint hum of conversation. Malachi stepped inside, greeted by the clink of plates and the soft chatter of patrons. A bell above the door jingled, drawing a few curious glances his way. Most turned back to their meals, but a handful of stares lingered just a bit too long. He approached the counter, where a young waitress with a warm smile greeted him. "Afternoon, sir, sit wherever you like." "Thank you," Malachi replied, his voice calm and measured. He chose a booth near the window, his back to the wall, a habit born of years of navigating spaces where he had to be constantly aware of his surroundings. As he sat, he noticed the quiet side glances from the other patrons. A middle-aged couple at the counter exchanged whispers, their expressions unreadable. A man in a crisp sheriff's uniform, sitting a few tables away, gave him a cursory glance before returning to his newspaper. Malachi wasn't a stranger to these reactions. They were subtle but unmistakable. The unspoken question of why someone like him was here. The waitress returned with a menu, her friendly demeanor unchanging. "Can I get you something to drink while you look this over?" "Just a coffee, please," Malachi said with a polite smile. "Coming right up." As Malachi waited, he looked around the diner. The walls were adorned with black and white photos of Elmwood's history, images of town parades, high school sports teams, and 4th of July celebrations. It was a reminder of how tightly knit the community was, and how out of place he must seem. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of raised voices near the kitchen. He glanced over to see a young black man in a delivery uniform arguing with the diner's manager, an older man with a stern expression. The delivery man's tone was defensive, his posture rigid. "I'm telling you, it's all there," the young man said, his voice tight with frustration. "I've been making these deliveries for months. You know I wouldn't short you." The manager shook his head, his voice loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "I don't care how long you've been working here, son. I'm telling you, we're missing items from this order, and it's your responsibility." The delivery man's face flushed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "With all due respect, sir, I double-checked everything before I left the warehouse." The exchange drew the attention of the other patrons, their murmurs filling the air. Malachi felt a familiar pang of discomfort. A situation where assumptions and biases were driving the narrative. He wanted to intervene, but knew he had to choose his moment carefully. The sheriff, who had been quietly observing from his table, finally spoke up. "What's going on over there, Pete?" he called to the manager, his tone casual but carrying an undertone of authority. "Just sorting out a little mix-up with our delivery," the manager replied, though his glare at the young man suggested something far less benign. The tension in the room was palpable, and Malachi decided he couldn't stay silent. Rising from his booth, he approached the counter, his presence drawing a few curious glances. He spoke calmly but firmly, addressing both the manager and the delivery man. "Excuse me," Malachi began, his tone measured. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is there a way to verify the delivery against the invoice? It seems like this could be resolved fairly easily." The manager turned to Malachi, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And who are you to get involved?" Malachi met his gaze without flinching. "Someone who believes every issue has a solution. I'm Dr. Malachi Rhodes." The title hung in the air for a moment, its weight causing a flicker of recognition, or perhaps resentment, in the manager's expression. The sheriff's eyebrows raised slightly, and the delivery man looked at Malachi with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Well, doctor," the manager said, his tone laced with thinly veiled skepticism, "this doesn't concern you. It's between me and him." "Perhaps," Malachi replied evenly, "but it does concern me when a young man is being accused without evidence. Let's take a look at the paperwork and clarify the situation." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed on the scene. The other patrons watched in silence, the air thick with anticipation. Reluctantly, the manager fetched the invoice and handed it to the delivery man. Together, they reviewed the list of items, Malachi standing by as a silent advocate. It didn't take long for the discrepancy to become clear. The missing items had been inadvertently omitted from the warehouse's inventory, as confirmed by a time-stamped receipt on the delivery man's clipboard. The young man exhaled, relief washing over his face. "See, I told you I double-checked everything." The manager muttered something under his breath, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Fine, looks like it's not your fault this time." Malachi's eyes narrowed slightly at the dismissive tone, but he chose not to press the issue. Instead, he turned to the delivery man. "Thank you for your professionalism. I hope this clears things up." The young man nodded, his expression grateful. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate it." As Malachi returned to his booth, he noticed the sheriff watching him closely. Their eyes met briefly, and Malachi could sense an undercurrent of tension. The sheriff folded his newspaper and stood, making his way to Malachi's table. "You handled that well," the sheriff said, his tone neutral. "But you might want to be careful about sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Malachi met his gaze evenly. "I believe fairness belongs everywhere, Sheriff." The sheriff's lips twitched into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Fair enough. Enjoy your coffee, doctor." As the sheriff walked away, Malachi couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter was far from over. The small act of stepping in had rippled through the diner, leaving an impression on everyone present. And while he didn't regret his actions, he knew they had drawn attention, both welcome and unwelcome. Sipping his coffee, Malachi looked out the window, the picturesque town square now feeling slightly less idyllic. The storm brewing in Elmwood wasn't one of weather, but of reckoning, and he could sense that his role in it was only beginning. Malachi sat quietly in his booth at the Maplewood Diner, sipping his coffee, as the events of the delivery dispute replayed in his mind. Outside, the sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the town square. The tense interaction left a lingering unease in the air, but Malachi maintained his calm demeanor. He was no stranger to these moments, subtle reminders that his success, credentials, and goodwill often mattered less than the assumptions people made based on his appearance. Across the diner, the sheriff had returned to his seat, though his focus seemed to linger on Malachi. Occasionally, their eyes would meet, and the sheriff's gaze was appraising, almost challenging. Malachi ignored it, turning his attention instead to the quiet hum of the diner. The waitress returned with a refill of his coffee, her smile warm but tinged with a trace of nervousness. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone polite but cautious. "Yes, "Thank you," Malachi replied, his voice steady. He didn't miss the way her eyes darted toward the sheriff, as if gauging his reaction. The subtle gestures, the undercurrents of tension. Malachi had seen them all before. They were the signs of a community grappling with deep-seated biases, where every interaction could shift from polite to hostile in an instant. Just as Malachi finished his coffee and prepared to leave, the sheriff rose from his seat, tossing a few bills on the counter, before making his way toward the door. As he passed Malachi's table, he paused, his shadow falling over the doctor. "You're not from around here, are you?" the sheriff asked, his tone casual but with an edge that couldn't be ignored. Malachi looked up, meeting the man's gaze. "No, I'm visiting for a few days' business." The sheriff folded his arms, his stance widening slightly. "Business, huh? What kind of business brings you to Elmwood?" Malachi maintained his composure, though he could feel the weight of the question. An interrogation masked as small talk. "I'm consulting with the local hospital. They're looking to improve their operations." "Consulting?" the sheriff repeated, his tone skeptical. "Well, I hope you find everything to your liking. We're a tight-knit community here, and we don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble." Malachi's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "I'm here to help, not to cause trouble." The sheriff's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Good, let's keep it that way." As the sheriff left, Malachi let out a slow breath, his hands tightening around his coffee mug. Moments like these were infuriating, not because of the overt hostility, but because of the way they chipped away at his dignity. It was a reminder that, no matter how accomplished or professional he was, he could still be reduced to a stereotype in the eyes of some. The next morning, Malachi arrived at Elmwood General Hospital for his first meeting with the board of directors. The hospital, though modest in size, was critical to the surrounding community, serving as the primary healthcare provider for miles. Malachi had been brought in to address inefficiencies, improve patient care, and help secure funding for much-needed upgrades. As he entered the boardroom, a chorus of polite greetings met him. The directors, mostly older men and women, sat around a long conference table. At the head of the table was Richard Hayes, the hospital administrator. Hayes was a tall, imposing man in his early 60s, with silver hair and a firm handshake. He greeted Malachi with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dr. Rhodes, welcome to Elmwood General," Hayes said, gesturing for Malachi to take a seat. "We're grateful you could join us on such short notice." "The pleasure is mine," Malachi replied, setting his briefcase on the table. "I'm looking forward to helping the hospital reach its full potential." As the meeting began, Malachi noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift in the room. While some of the board members seemed genuinely interested in his proposals, others, like Hayes, appeared dismissive. Their body language closed off. When Malachi presented data on inefficiencies and outlined his recommendations, Hayes interrupted him repeatedly, questioning his conclusions and downplaying the issues. "I understand where you're coming from, Dr. Rhodes," Hayes said at one point, leaning back in his chair. "But I'm not sure these changes are practical for a hospital of our size." Malachi kept his voice calm but firm. "With respect, Mr. Hayes, these changes aren't just practical, they're necessary. The data speaks for itself. Delaying these improvements will only exacerbate the issues and put patients at risk." Hayes's smile tightened. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, doctor, but you have to understand how things work around here. Elmwood isn't a big city. We have our own way of doing things." Malachi felt the frustration building, but refused to let it show. "I respect that, Mr. Hayes. My goal isn't to impose, it's to collaborate and find solutions that benefit everyone." The tension in the room was palpable, but Malachi pressed on, determined to make his case. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that while some board members were receptive, others, led by Hayes, viewed him as an outsider with no right to challenge their way of doing things. Later that afternoon, as Malachi walked through the hospital's corridors, he overheard snippets of conversation from staff members. Nurses spoke in hushed tones about budget cuts and understaffing, while a janitor muttered about broken equipment that hadn't been replaced in years. The more he listened, the clearer it became that the hospital's problems ran deeper than he'd initially thought. As he rounded a corner, he found Hayes waiting for him, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Rhodes, a word?" Malachi nodded, following Hayes into a small, windowless office. Hayes closed the door behind them, leaning against the desk with his arms crossed. "Look, I'm sure you mean well," Hayes began, his tone measured. "But you need to understand something. This hospital has been running just fine for decades. We don't need an outsider coming in and telling us how to do our jobs." Malachi met his gaze, unflinching. "If the hospital were running just fine, Mr. Hayes, I wouldn't have been brought here. My role is to identify areas for improvement and help implement changes that will benefit both staff and patients." Hayes's eyes narrowed. "And I'm telling you, there are limits to what this community will tolerate. You may have fancy degrees and big city experience, but that doesn't mean you know what's best for Elmwood." The words were a thinly veiled threat, but Malachi refused to back down. "My focus is on the well-being of this community. If that means challenging the status quo, so be it." Hayes's jaw tightened, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Hayes pushed off the desk, straightening his tie. "Just remember, Dr. Rhodes, change isn't always welcome. Tread carefully." As Hayes left, Malachi felt a surge of determination. He knew he was walking into a storm, but he also knew he couldn't turn back. The stakes were too high, not just for the hospital, but for the community it served. Over the next few days, the resistance Malachi faced became more overt. Equipment he requested for evaluations was mysteriously unavailable. Staff members who had been eager to collaborate suddenly avoided him, their eyes downcast. He began to receive vague warnings from well-meaning employees, urging him to be cautious. During one particularly frustrating afternoon, Malachi found himself in the hospital cafeteria, sipping a cup of coffee and reviewing his notes. A young nurse approached him hesitantly. Her expression conflicted. "Dr. Rhodes," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "I just wanted to say, thank you for what you're trying to do. A lot of us support you, even if we can't say it out loud." Malachi looked up, his brow furrowing. "Why can't you say it out loud?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the cafeteria entrance. "Because speaking up comes with consequences. People here, they don't like change, and if you push too hard, they'll find a way to push back." Before Malachi could respond, the nurse hurried away, leaving him with more questions than answers. The warning only reinforced what he already knew. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one he couldn't afford to lose. Dr. Malachi Rhodes stood outside the hospital's main entrance, his jaw clenched as he stared at the email on his phone. It was a curt message from Richard Hayes, the hospital administrator, announcing a temporary suspension of Malachi's consulting duties. The email was filled with vague justifications about community concerns and administrative reevaluation, but the underlying intent was clear. They were shutting him out. The words on the screen blurred slightly as Malachi fought the anger rising in his chest. He had seen this tactic before: bureaucratic obfuscation used to mask deeper biases and corruption. Hayes wasn't just trying to block progress, he was trying to make Malachi leave, but leaving wasn't an option. As Malachi mulled over his next move, a young nurse named Karen approached him hesitantly. She was one of the few staff members who had shown consistent support for his work, though always in subtle, cautious ways. Her expression was tight with worry as she glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. "Dr. Rhodes," she whispered urgently, "I need to talk to you." Malachi lowered his phone and nodded. "What is it?" Karen hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you need to see. I overheard a conversation in the staff lounge, between Hayes and one of the department heads. They're not just trying to push you out, they're covering something up." Malachi's eyes narrowed. "What kind of cover-up?" Karen shifted uncomfortably, her hands twisting together. "It's about the hospital's funding. Hayes has been redirecting money from state grants, money that's supposed to go toward patient care and equipment upgrades. Instead, it's going into a private account, and he's not doing it alone." Malachi's stomach tightened. This was worse than he'd imagined. "Do you have proof?" Karen nodded quickly. "I overheard them talking about invoices and dummy accounts. I can't access them directly, but I know someone who can. Mitchell, one of the IT techs, has access to the financial systems. He's hesitant to get involved, but I think he'd listen to you." "Where can I find him?" Malachi asked, his voice firm. Karen glanced at her watch. He's usually in the basement office this time of day, but Dr. Rhodes, be careful Hayes doesn't play fair. If he finds out you're digging into this, he won't just stop at emails. The hospital basement was a stark contrast to the bustling upper floors. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a cold, sterile glow over the narrow hallways. Malachi found Mitchell hunched over a computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The young man looked up with a start as Malachi entered, his eyes wide with surprise. "Dr. Rhodes," Mitchell stammered, I wasn't expecting you." Malachi offered a calm but serious smile. "I need your help. Mitchell Karen told me you have access to the hospital's financial records." Mitchell's face flushed, and he quickly looked away. "I don't know what she told you, but I can't." "Mitchell," Malachi interrupted gently, "I know this is risky, but the integrity of this hospital, and the community it serves, is at stake. If what Karen says is true, lives are being put in jeopardy. I can't confront Hayes without evidence, and you're the only one who can help me find it." Mitchell hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "If I get caught—" "You won't," Malachi said, his voice steady. "I'll take full responsibility. You have my word." After a long moment, Mitchell sighed and nodded. "All right, but we need to move fast. Hayes keeps close tabs on these records." As Mitchell began navigating the hospital's financial database, Malachi stood behind him, his heart pounding. The screen filled with spreadsheets and account logs, and within minutes, they found it. A series of transactions that confirmed Karen's suspicions. Funds earmarked for equipment upgrades had been funneled into accounts tied to a shell company. The amounts were staggering, and the trail led directly back to Hayes. "This is it," Mitchell said, his voice hushed. "This is the proof." Malachi nodded, his mind racing. "Can you download these files? We need to secure them." Mitchell inserted a flash drive and began transferring the data. Just as the progress bar reached 90%, the computer screen flickered and a warning message appeared. "Access denied. Administrator override." "Damn it," Mitchell muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard in a desperate attempt to bypass the block. "He's on to us." Before Malachi could respond, the door to the office burst open, and 2 hospital security guards entered, their expressions grim. "Dr. Rhodes," one of them said, his tone clipped. "You need to come with us." The guards escorted Malachi through the hospital, their grip on his arms firm, but not rough. Staff members and patients alike stopped to stare, their whispers filling the air like static. Malachi's jaw tightened as he forced himself to remain calm. This was exactly what Hayes wanted. A public spectacle to discredit him. As they reached the main lobby, Hayes was waiting, flanked by the sheriff and a few hospital board members. The sheriff's presence sent a chill down Malachi's spine. It was a clear signal that this wasn't just a hospital matter anymore. "Dr. Rhodes," Hayes began, his tone dripping with feigned regret. "I'm afraid we have no choice but to suspend you indefinitely. Your actions have violated hospital policy and compromised the trust of our staff." Malachi met Hayes's gaze, his voice unwavering. "The only trust that's been compromised here is yours. Mr. Hayes, I know about the embezzlement, the funds you've been diverting from patient care." A ripple of gasps spread through the crowd, and Hayes's expression darkened. "That's a serious accusation, Dr. One. I suggest you tread lightly with." "It's not an accusation," Malachi countered, his voice rising just enough to carry. "It's a fact, and I have the evidence to prove it." Hayes's smile faltered, but before he could respond, the sheriff stepped forward. "That's enough," he said, his tone authoritative. "Dr. Rhodes, you're causing a disturbance. I suggest you leave the premises immediately." "And if I don't?" Malachi asked, his calm exterior masking the fire burning inside him. The sheriff's hand moved to his belt, resting on his handcuffs. "Then I'll have to escort you out." For a moment, the 2 men locked eyes, the tension between them thick enough to cut. Finally, Malachi raised his hands in surrender. "No need, I'll leave." As he walked out of the hospital, escorted by security, Malachi could feel the weight of every gaze on him. The humiliation was palpable, but it only strengthened his resolve. Hayes and the sheriff might think they'd won, but the battle was far from over. That evening, Malachi sat in his hotel room, the stolen flash drive resting on the desk in front of him. Though they hadn't been able to download all the files, Mitchell had managed to save enough to expose Hayes's corruption. It wasn't as complete as Malachi had hoped, but it was a start. He opened his laptop and began composing an email to a journalist he trusted, a former colleague who had built a reputation for uncovering corruption in small-town systems. If Hayes wanted a public spectacle, Malachi would give him one. But this time, the truth would be on display for everyone to see. Just as he hit send, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Be careful, they're watching you." Malachi stared at the screen, the weight of the warning settling over him. The stakes had just risen, and the path forward was fraught with danger, but he had come too far to back down now. Dr. Malachi Rhodes paced the length of his hotel room, his thoughts racing as he replayed the humiliation at Elmwood General. Every muscle in his body ached with tension, but his resolve was steel. Hayes thought he could silence him with a spectacle, but Malachi had faced tougher battles. He was determined to uncover the corruption threatening the town's most vulnerable. The flash drive sat on the desk beside his laptop. Mitchell's partial download had provided enough evidence to connect Hayes to the shell accounts, but the missing files left gaps that could weaken their case. Malachi's mind raced through possibilities: how to fill in the blanks, how to ensure Hayes and his cronies were held accountable. The unknown message still blinked on his phone screen. "Be careful, they're watching you." The warning felt more ominous with each passing second. Was it Karen Mitchell? Or someone working with Hayes? Malachi's instincts told him that the stakes had shifted. And this was no longer just a battle of wills. It was a fight for the truth, against people willing to go to dangerous lengths to protect their secrets. The next morning, Malachi met Karen in a secluded corner of the hospital's staff parking lot. She was pale and visibly nervous, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. "They know something's up," she whispered, clutching a folder to her chest. "Hayes has been calling emergency meetings with the board. They're scrambling." "That's good," Malachi said, trying to reassure her. "It means we've got them rattled, but we need more." "What's in the folder?" Karen hesitated before handing it to him. "It's all I could get from the administrative offices before they started locking everything down: expense reports, payment records. It's not much, but it might help." Malachi flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. The documents confirmed more of the discrepancies Mitchell had uncovered, but still left questions unanswered. "This is helpful, Karen, thank you." Karen swallowed hard. "Be careful. Dr. Rhodes Hayes isn't just a bully, he's connected. People in this town owe him favors, and he knows how to use them." Malachi gave her a small nod, his face calm even as the warning settled heavily in his chest. "I won't let that stop me." Later that day, Malachi met with Mitchell in a coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Mitchell looked like he hadn't slept, his hands trembling slightly as he stirred his coffee. "They locked me out of the system," Mitchell said, his voice low. "I don't think I can access anything else without raising red flags." "That's okay," Malachi assured him. "What you've already done is invaluable, but I need one last favor." Mitchell looked up, his eyes wary but expectant. "What is it?" "I need to know who else might have access to these accounts. Someone on the inside who hasn't been compromised." Mitchell hesitated, his gaze darting to the side. "There's a woman in accounting. Marlene. She's honest. Too honest for Hayes to trust her with anything sensitive, but she might know where to look." "Can you reach out to her?" Malachi asked. Mitchell nodded reluctantly. "I'll try, but if she gets suspicious, it could backfire." "Just be careful," Malachi said. "We're close, Mitchell. I can feel it." As the day wore on, the pressure against Malachi intensified. He began noticing subtle signs that he was being followed. An unfamiliar car parked near his hotel, the same faces appearing wherever he went. His phone rang several times, but the calls disconnected as soon as he answered. Hayes wasn't just trying to scare him, he was trying to isolate him, to make him feel vulnerable. Late that afternoon, Malachi received a call from a blocked number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Dr. Rhodes," came a familiar voice. It was the sheriff. "We need to talk." Malachi's jaw tightened. "I don't think we have much to discuss, Sheriff." "Oh, I think we do," the sheriff said, his tone menacingly calm. "You've been stirring up a lot of trouble for some good people in this town. Maybe it's time you learned how things work around here." Malachi's grip on the phone tightened. If this is meant to intimidate me, Sheriff, it won't work. Who said anything about intimidation? The sheriff replied, a faint chuckle in his voice. Let's just say, if you keep digging, you might not like what you find. The call ended abruptly, leaving Malachi staring at his phone, his mind racing. The warning wasn't just a scare tactic, it was a reminder of the power structures entrenched in the town and how far they were willing to go to protect themselves. The following evening, Malachi decided to attend a town hall meeting. It was a chance to gauge the community's mood and possibly find allies who shared his concerns about the hospital. The meeting was held in the town's community center, a modest building with rows of folding chairs and a small stage. As Malachi entered, he immediately felt the weight of the stairs. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and he caught fragments of conversations, some supportive, others suspicious. At the front of the room, Hayes stood with a group of town officials, his expression smug as he surveyed the attendees. The meeting began with routine updates on local infrastructure and public safety, but it wasn't long before Hayes took the floor. I'd like to address some recent disruptions involving Elmwood General Hospital, Hayes said, his voice smooth and authoritative. Certain individuals have been spreading misinformation and creating unnecessary alarm. Let me assure you, our hospital is running efficiently, and any accusations to the contrary are baseless. Malachi's blood boiled as he listened, but he forced himself to stay calm. When Hayes invited questions from the audience, Malachi rose to his feet. Mr. Hayes, Malachi began, his voice steady but loud enough to command attention. Can you explain why hospital funds meant for patient care have been redirected to private accounts? The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Hayes. For a moment, the administrator's composure slipped, but he quickly recovered, flashing a tight smile. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Dr. Rhodes, Hayes replied. If you have evidence to support such a claim, I suggest you present it through proper channels. I'd be happy to, Malachi said, stepping closer to the stage. But we both know those channels have been blocked. You've gone to great lengths to conceal your actions, Mr. Hayes, but the truth has a way of coming to light. Hayes's smile vanished, replaced by a hard glare. This isn't the time or place for baseless accusations, Doctor. Perhaps you should leave before you cause more disruption. Malachi stood his ground, his voice rising. The disruption isn't mine, Mr. Hayes, it's yours, and the people of this town deserve to know the truth about what's happening in their hospital. The tension in the room was electric, the crowd murmuring as they watched the confrontation unfold. Hayes glanced toward the sheriff, who was sitting near the back of the room, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Enough, the sheriff said, standing up. Dr. Rhodes, I'm placing you under arrest for disturbing the peace. The room erupted in gasps and protests as the sheriff moved toward Malachi, handcuffs in hand. Malachi raised his hands in surrender, but kept his gaze locked on Hayes. This isn't over, Malachi said, his voice unwavering as the sheriff led him toward the exit. The truth will come out. As the doors closed behind him, Malachi couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment he had been silenced, at least temporarily. But the battle was far from lost. The evidence he held was enough to expose Hayes and his corruption, but only if he could find a way to get it into the right hands. Sitting in the dim light of a holding cell, Malachi felt the faint vibration of his phone, which the sheriff had overlooked during his hasty arrest. A single text message from Mitchell flashed on the screen. Marlene has the files, she's ready to help. We just need you to guide us. Malachi smiled grimly. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Dr. Malachi Rhodes sat in the holding cell, his mind a whirlwind of plans. The text from Mitchell had reignited his resolve. Marlene had the files, the missing piece to expose Richard Hayes and the corrupt network behind him. The stakes had never been higher. If he failed, the hospital's patients, staff, and the community would continue to suffer under the weight of Hayes's greed and systemic racism. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Moments later, the sheriff appeared, keys jingling in his hand. His smirk was smug, his eyes gleaming with condescension. Looks like you've got visitors, the sheriff said, unlocking the cell. Don't try anything funny. Malachi stood slowly, his expression calm, but his fists clenched. Outside the station's small interrogation room stood Hayes, flanked by the hospital's legal counsel and 2 board members. The air was thick with tension as Malachi was ushered into the room. The sheriff took a position by the door, arms crossed, his presence a clear warning. Hayes wasted no time. "Dr. Rhodes," he began, his voice smooth but laced with menace, "this little crusade of yours ends now. Whatever you think you've uncovered is nothing more than a misunderstanding." Malachi met Hayes's gaze, unflinching. "A misunderstanding? Is that what you call stealing funds meant for patient care? Or silencing whistleblowers who dare to question you?" Hayes's facade of calm cracked for a brief moment before he recovered. "You're out of your depth, doctor. You have no proof, and even if you did, no one would believe you over me." Malachi took a deep breath, centering himself. "I may be outnumbered here, Hayes, but I'm not outmatched. Marlene has the files. Every transaction, every forged signature, every fraudulent account, it's all there." The room fell silent. Hayes's expression darkened, and he glanced toward the sheriff, who shifted uncomfortably. The tension in the room was palpable. "You're bluffing," Hayes said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Am I?" Malachi countered. "You know as well as I do that this town is tired of being exploited. Once those files go public, it won't just be your career on the line, it'll be your freedom." The board members exchanged nervous glances. One of them, a middle-aged woman named Linda Connors, cleared her throat. "Richard, if there's even a chance he's telling the truth, we need to address this, the hospital's reputation." Hayes cut her off sharply. "Quiet, Linda. This is under control." Malachi seized the moment, turning to the board members. "It's not under control, and you know it. Hayes has been using your names to shield his actions. When this comes out, and it will, you'll be held accountable too." Linda's face paled, and the other board member, a balding man in his 60s, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The cracks in Hayes's armor were starting to show. Hayes leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "You're playing a dangerous game, Rhodes. You think you can waltz into this town and turn everyone against me? You don't understand how things work here." Malachi stood his ground. "I understand perfectly. You thrive on fear and complacency. But people like Marlene, Mitchell, and Karen, they're done being afraid. They've already taken the first step by coming forward." Hayes's composure finally broke. "You think they'll protect you? They're nobodies. I've built this hospital. I've built this town. Without me, it all falls apart." The outburst sent a ripple of unease through the room. The sheriff shifted his weight, his hand brushing against the baton on his belt. The board members exchanged wide-eyed glances, clearly shaken by Hayes's admission. Malachi took a step closer, his voice steady and commanding. "That's where you're wrong. The hospital isn't yours. It belongs to the people who rely on it, the doctors and nurses who work tirelessly despite your mismanagement, the patients who trust us to care for them." "Your time is up, Hayes." The door to the room opened suddenly, and Marlene entered, clutching a thick folder. Her face was resolute, though her hands trembled slightly. "I think you all need to see this." She placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing pages of damning evidence, bank statements, email correspondences, and internal memos implicating Hayes in a web of financial fraud. The board members leaned forward, their expressions a mix of disbelief and horror. Hayes's face turned ashen. "You had no right." "I had every right," Marlene said, her voice shaking but firm. "You've been stealing from the hospital, from the community, and from people who trusted you. I won't stay silent anymore." The room erupted into chaos. The board members demanded explanations, the sheriff attempted to restore order, and Hayes shouted over them all, his voice cracking under the weight of his unraveling power. Malachi stepped back, letting the scene play out. He felt a surge of vindication, but knew the battle wasn't over yet. Hayes was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. The sheriff finally raised his voice, silencing the room. "Enough. Everyone calm down." He turned to Malachi, his expression grim. "Dr. Rhodes, you're still under arrest. This evidence doesn't change the fact that you've been causing disturbances." "It changes everything," Malachi interrupted, his voice ringing with authority. "This evidence proves that Hayes and everyone protecting him have been complicit in criminal activity. If you arrest me, Sheriff, you'll be arresting the one person trying to save this hospital." The sheriff hesitated, his hand twitching near his belt. Malachi could see the doubt flickering in his eyes. For the first time, the man's allegiance to Hayes seemed uncertain. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Marlene said, her voice cutting through the tension. "The files have already been backed up. If anything happens to Dr. Rhodes, or to me, they'll go straight to the state attorney general." Hayes's face twisted in rage. "You think you've won? This town doesn't care about your evidence, they care about results, and I've delivered." "No," Malachi said, stepping forward. "You've exploited. And now it's over." The sheriff took a step back, his hand falling away from his belt. The room was silent, except for the sound of Hayes's labored breathing. The board members whispered among themselves, their confidence in Hayes clearly shattered. Suddenly, Hayes lunged for the folder. His desperation boiling over, Marlene cried out, and the room erupted into chaos once more. Malachi moved quickly, blocking Hayes's path and forcing him back against the table. The sheriff stepped in, pulling Hayes away, as the man shouted incoherently. "You'll regret this!" Hayes screamed as he was dragged toward the door. "You think you're a hero, Rhodes? You're nothing!" As the door slammed shut behind Hayes and the sheriff, the room fell quiet. Malachi turned to the remaining board members and Marlene, his expression resolute. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We have the truth, now we need to make sure it's heard." Marlene nodded, her eyes glistening with determination. "Let's do it." The dimly lit courthouse hallway was eerily silent as Dr. Malachi Rhodes stood at the threshold of the chambers where the emergency board meeting was being held. Outside, a storm raged, rain pounding against the large windows, mirroring the tension simmering inside Malachi. This was it. The moment he had been preparing for his evidence was ready. His arguments sharpened, but the stakes had never been higher. Malachi pushed the heavy wooden doors open, stepping into the boardroom. The council sat around a long table, their faces tense and pale. At the head of the table sat Richard Hayes, his smug expression faltering slightly as Malachi entered. Hayes quickly masked his unease with a veneer of confidence, but the shift didn't escape Malachi's notice. "Dr. Rhodes," Hayes said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't realize this meeting required your attendance." Malachi ignored the jab, his gaze sweeping over the room. "It does when the decisions being made will impact the lives of every patient and employee at Elmwood General." The tension was palpable as Malachi placed a thick folder of documents on the table. He spoke calmly, but his voice carried the weight of righteous determination. "Before we proceed, I think it's important that everyone here understands what's at stake." Hayes smirked, leaning forward. "Enlighten us, doctor. Or is this another baseless accusation?" Malachi fixed him with an unflinching gaze. "This isn't baseless, Hayes. It's evidence, concrete proof of your mismanagement, embezzlement, and the systematic siphoning of hospital funds into your personal accounts. And before you try to deny it, let me remind you that this information has been verified by multiple sources." Hayes's smirk disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You've overstepped, Rhodes. Whatever documents you have won't hold up, and even if they did, this town knows who's been keeping its hospital running." Malachi didn't flinch. "Running it into the ground, you mean? Your greed has put lives at risk. Patients have died because of the corners you've cut. And when anyone dared to question you, you silenced them, intimidated them, because you thought you were untouchable." Malachi flipped through the folder, pulling out a series of documents and spreading them across the table. The council members leaned forward, their expressions ranging from shock to horror as they examined the evidence. Wire transfers to offshore accounts, falsified budgets, and emails linking Hayes to fraudulent transactions. Hayes's face darkened. "You have no right to bring this here." "I have every right," Malachi countered, his voice rising. "This isn't just about you, Hayes. It's about the nurses struggling with outdated equipment, the patients who can't get the care they need, and the community you've betrayed." One of the council members, Linda Connors, spoke up, her voice trembling. "Richard, is this true? Have you been stealing from the hospital?" Hayes glared at her. "Don't be naive. Linda, running a hospital isn't charity work. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made." "Sacrifices?" Malachi shot back, his anger barely contained. "The only sacrifice here has been the trust of this community, and you've profited off their suffering." The council erupted into murmurs, their faith in Hayes clearly shaken. Hayes, sensing his grip slipping, leaned forward, his voice sharp and menacing. "Let's not pretend you're a saint, Rhodes. You're an outsider. You don't know how things work here." Malachi met his gaze evenly. "I know enough. I know that your sacrifices have nothing to do with helping this community. They're about lining your pockets and consolidating power, but that ends now." He pulled out a USB drive and held it up. "This contains everything, every shady deal, every stolen dollar. It's been sent to the State Attorney General's office, the Department of Health, and multiple media outlets. By this time tomorrow, your name will be synonymous with corruption." A collective gasp filled the room. Hayes's carefully constructed facade crumbled, and his voice rose in panic. "You think you can destroy me? I built this hospital. I built this town." "No," Malachi said firmly. "You exploited it, and now you'll face the consequences." Hayes's desperation turned to anger as he stood, pointing a finger at Malachi. "You don't understand who you're dealing with. I have connections, people who can make this disappear." Malachi's resolve was unshaken. "You're welcome to try. But this isn't disappearing, Hayes. Not this time." The sheriff, who had been silently watching from the corner, stepped forward. His hand rested on the baton at his hip, and his expression was conflicted. "This is getting out of hand." Malachi turned to him. "Sheriff, you've spent years turning a blind eye to this man's actions. But now you have a choice. Stand with him and go down with him, or do what's right for the people you swore to protect." The sheriff hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. The weight of the room's collective gaze bore down on him, and for a moment, the tension was unbearable. Finally, he stepped back, lowering his hand. "I'm done protecting you, Richard." Hayes's face twisted with fury. "You coward!" Malachi took a deep breath, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "This is your chance to do the right thing. Step down, cooperate with the investigation, and maybe you can salvage some dignity." Hayes laughed bitterly, his voice cracking. "You think this is over? You have no idea what you've started." The doors to the boardroom burst open, and two men in suits entered, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Richard Hayes," one of them announced. "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice." As the agents cuffed Hayes and led him away, he shot Malachi a venomous glare. "You'll regret this, Rhodes." Malachi stood tall, his heart pounding, but his expression calm. He had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. Hayes's words lingered, a chilling reminder that corruption ran deep in Elmwood. As the council members turned to him with questions, concerns, and even apologies, Malachi knew one thing: this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. The news of Richard Hayes's arrest spread like wildfire through Elmwood. Local papers ran the story under bold headlines, and the town's radio stations buzzed with discussion. Malachi Rhodes, once an outsider and a figure of controversy, was now hailed as the man who had toppled a tyrant. The hospital board convened an emergency meeting the morning after Hayes's arrest. Without Hayes dominating the room, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Linda Connors, one of the board members who had initially been hesitant to challenge Hayes, took the lead. "We owe Dr. Rhodes an apology," Linda began, her voice steady but contrite. "Not only for doubting his intentions, but for being complicit in allowing Richard Hayes to exploit this hospital for so long." Malachi nodded, acknowledging her words but not letting her off easily. "An apology is a start, but what matters now is action. The hospital needs transparency, accountability, and a commitment to prioritizing patient care above all else. We can't afford to repeat the mistakes of the past." In the days that followed, investigators uncovered even more evidence of Hayes's corruption. His network of bribes, fraudulent contracts, and intimidation tactics stretched far beyond the hospital. Several town officials were implicated, including the sheriff, who ultimately resigned under mounting public pressure. Malachi worked closely with the State Attorney General's office, providing testimony and helping connect the dots in Hayes's sprawling web of deceit. Watching the legal system move against Hayes was both satisfying and sobering. It was a reminder that justice required relentless effort, and the fight didn't end with one man's downfall. The ordeal had changed Malachi in ways he hadn't anticipated. When he first arrived in Elmwood, he'd seen the town as a challenge to overcome, a puzzle to solve. Now, it was more than that. It was a community worth fighting for. The gratitude of patients, staff, and even strangers in the street reminded him why he had chosen this path. But the journey hadn't been without cost. The stress of the battle had taken a toll on his health, his relationships, and his sense of security. Yet, through it all, he found strength in the people who had stood by him. Marlene, Mitchell, and the nurses who had risked their jobs to speak out. One evening, Marlene visited Malachi in his office, her arms full of paperwork. "The board's approved the new oversight measures," she said, setting the documents on his desk. "We're finally making progress." Malachi leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's a start." Marlene hesitated, then added, "You know, you could have left. After everything Hayes put you through, no one would have blamed you for walking away." "I thought about it," Malachi admitted. "But running wouldn't have changed anything. If we want better, we have to stay and fight for it." The reforms Malachi spearheaded went beyond the hospital. His fight had sparked a broader movement in Elmwood. Community leaders organized town hall meetings to address long-standing issues of inequality and corruption. Residents who had once felt powerless now found their voices, demanding better from their elected officials. The hospital itself underwent a dramatic transformation. With Hayes gone, funding was redirected toward critical improvements, modernized equipment, increased staff salaries, and expanded community health programs. For the first time in years, Elmwood General felt like a place of hope. One quiet afternoon, Malachi visited the hospital's garden, a small but serene space that had been neglected under Hayes's tenure. Now, it was being restored by volunteers. He sat on a bench, watching as a nurse and a group of children planted flowers. The scene filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. Marlene found him there, her expression thoughtful. "I wanted to tell you," she began. "The staff is planning a celebration. They think you deserve some recognition." Malachi chuckled softly. "I'm not sure I'm the celebrating type." "You're the reason we're still standing," Marlene said firmly. "Let them thank you." He looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. "All right, but only if we celebrate everyone who made this possible. This wasn't just me." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the garden, Malachi reflected on what lay ahead. The fight against systemic injustice was far from over, but Elmwood had proven that change was possible. Marlene sat beside him, a hopeful smile on her face. "What's next for you?" "I don't know yet," Malachi admitted. "But I do know this. If we can fix what's broken here, maybe we can inspire other places to do the same." Marlene nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "One step at a time." As they sat in silence, the distant laughter of children filled the air, a reminder of the future they were building together. As the dust settled in Elmwood, the story of Dr. Malachi Rhodes became a testament to the strength of integrity and the power of resilience. What began as a daunting battle against corruption and prejudice had transformed into a movement that not only changed a hospital, but ignited a broader conversation about justice and accountability. Malachi sat in his modest office, now filled with light and warmth. The once intimidating stacks of paperwork had been replaced with framed photos of the hospital staff, smiling patients, and letters of gratitude from the community. These mementos served as a reminder of the progress that had been made, but also of the work that still lay ahead. For Malachi, the journey had been transformative. When he arrived in Elmwood, he was a skilled surgeon and a determined CEO, but he had underestimated the depth of the systemic challenges he would face. He had thought his expertise and credentials would be enough to enact change, but he quickly learned that fighting against entrenched power structures required more than skill. It demanded courage, collaboration, and an unrelenting belief in the possibility of a better future. Through the ordeal, Malachi discovered new layers of strength within himself. The challenges he faced, the hostility, the public humiliation, the physical threats, could have broken him, but instead, they deepened his resolve. He learned to lean on allies, to listen to the voices of those who had been silenced, and to channel his anger into action. One of the most profound lessons Malachi took from his experience was the importance of standing firm in the face of fear. There were moments when he wanted to give up, to walk away from the fight, and return to a simpler, quieter life. But he knew that doing so would betray the trust of those who had placed their faith in him. He also realized that his presence as a black leader in a position of power was, in itself, a challenge to the status quo, and that his success would inspire others to pursue their own paths of resistance and change. The fall of Richard Hayes sent shockwaves through Elmwood and beyond. For years, the hospital had been a microcosm of the systemic issues plaguing institutions across the country. Greed overshadowing compassion, racism masquerading as policy, and unchecked power perpetuating inequality. By exposing Hayes's corruption, Malachi not only brought justice to the hospital, but also illuminated the broader issues at play. The reforms that followed were a direct result of Malachi's relentless pursuit of accountability. The hospital implemented new oversight measures, ensured equitable hiring practices, and established a community advisory board to provide residents with a voice in its operations. These changes were tangible victories, but they were also symbolic of a larger cultural shift. Elmwood itself began to transform. Inspired by Malachi's courage, residents organized town hall meetings, advocated for policy changes, and demanded greater transparency from local officials. The town's media began highlighting stories of resilience and progress, fostering a sense of hope that had long been absent. Malachi's journey underscored a painful truth. Systemic problems like racism and corruption thrive in silence. They persist because those in power rely on fear and complacency to maintain control. But his story also revealed a powerful antidote: collective action. By refusing to stay silent, by rallying allies, and by confronting injustice head-on, Malachi showed that change is not only possible, but inevitable when people come together with a shared purpose. For the audience, Malachi's story serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. It highlights the importance of vigilance, the necessity of speaking out, and the value of holding power to account. It reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, progress begins with a single act of defiance. Despite the victories, Malachi knew his work was far from finished. Corruption and prejudice were not problems that could be solved overnight. They were deeply rooted, woven into the fabric of institutions and communities. But he also knew that every step forward mattered. Every policy change, every empowered voice, every exposed injustice brought society closer to the ideals of equity and fairness. As Malachi looked out the window of his office, he thought about the future. The fight for justice would continue, and he was ready to play his part. He envisioned mentoring young leaders, collaborating with activists, and using his platform to amplify marginalized voices. He saw a future where hospitals like Elmwood General weren't just places of healing, but symbols of integrity and hope. In the end, Malachi's story is about more than one man's battle against corruption. It's about the power of resilience, the necessity of collaboration, and the enduring belief that justice is worth fighting for. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found, and that each of us has the ability to spark that light. As the story of Elmwood continues to unfold, one truth remains clear. Change is never easy, but it is always possible. Through courage, determination, and a willingness to stand together, we can build a world where justice prevails, and where every voice is heard. And as Malachi Rhodes steps into the next chapter of his life, he does so with the knowledge that while the road ahead may be challenging, it is one worth traveling. For himself, for his community, and for the generations yet to come.